Long before 1933, the year he rose to power, Adolf Hitler wrote, "With the help of a persistent propaganda, even heaven can be represented to the people as hell, and the most wretched life as paradise." From the beginnings of the Nazi Party in the early 1920s until the fall of the Third Reich in 1945, Hitler and his propaganda minister, Dr. Joseph Goebbels, directed an intricate propaganda campaign steeped in secrecy and based on lies and manipulation. The implementation and impact of the Nazis' propaganda machine was as calculated and as deadly a force as their Panzer or Luftwaffe strikes. Propaganda was essential in bringing a dictator to power, a nation to war, and a continent to its knees. One of history's most heinous couplings, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Goebbels, began with two frustrated artists struggling to find acceptance. Rejected as a painter in early 20th century Vienna, Hitler found solace in that city's rampant German nationalism and anti-Semitism. When World War I erupted, Hitler fought passionately, fueled by his love for Germany and his hatred for the Jews. When Germany surrendered in 1918, Hitler was devastated.
The catastrophe of the loss of the First World War, in which he had served at the front with distinction, was a trauma which affected him profoundly. And I believe that when Hitler said, "Had we not put down our weapons at 5 minutes before midnight, we would have won," this is the way he thought, that this was a crime, this was a stab in the back by Jews and other forces on the home front.
Joseph Goebbels had also hoped to fight for Germany in the First World War, but had been rejected because of a crippled foot, the result of contracting polio as a child. He spent the war years earning a doctoral degree in German literature. All of his efforts to get his writings published were rejected, sometimes by Jewish publishers. His already intense feelings of inadequacy and resentment blossomed into rage, much of it anti-Semitic. In 1923, Germany plunged into economic depression and political chaos. For most Germans, it was a time of fear and anxiety, but for Goebbels, it was an opportunity for action.
In 1923, he briefly worked for a bank and could have started a normal bourgeois life. But he left the bank because the work did not amount to what he had imagined for himself. Anybody else would have been happy about having a job at a time of such economical hardship, but he was worried about other things.
That same year, Adolf Hitler led his recently formed ultra-right-wing National Socialist Party in a failed revolution. He was sent to prison where he wrote his political testament, Mein Kampf. He dedicated 2 entire chapters to expanding and refining his ideas about propaganda. As Hitler struggled to rebuild a political force, now renamed the Nazi Party, Goebbels was searching for a venue for his own radical ideas. He found support in National Socialism, which embraced his previously rejected literary talents. His skill at inflammatory, often anti-Semitic writing and charismatic public speaking quickly earned him Hitler's admiration. They met in 1925.
He was longing for a great man, a leader, one that would lead Germany out of its misery. He was thinking of a second Bismarck. The words, "Bismarck stand up," can be read in his diary. And when he met Hitler for the first time, he immediately knew. This is the man who I will follow unconditionally, and whatever I can do to help him to power, I will do.
One of the first positions Hitler assigned Goebbels was propaganda leader of Berlin, a communist stronghold. There, Goebbels showed his skill in psychological manipulation, turning a small band of street thugs into heroes fighting against the Jewish-controlled press and against the Nazis' political opponents.
When the Nazis marched in Berlin, where they were outnumbered by the Socialists and the Reds many times over, they would sometimes go through a red-infested area, a working-class area, knowing they would be pelted with garbage and have to be surrounded by the police and armored personnel carriers and everything else. This was tremendous propaganda.
When the Great Depression hit Germany in 1929, it left the already fragile nation on the brink of hysteria. Goebbels preyed on this fear, blaming the country's woes on communists, socialists, and above all, the Jews. He proclaimed Hitler the only possible savior for Germany. In an omniscient campaign, Hitler was presented in mythic proportions. In simple, repetitious speech laced with vicious attacks against his enemies and a tone of rising hysteria, Hitler mesmerized his audiences. One of those who got an early first-hand glimpse of Hitler was Howard K. Smith, a journalist who covered the war for CBS Radio in Berlin.
I listened to him, and frankly, I grew frightened. He had a very raucous voice, a strong voice, a resonant voice, too. But it was a menacing voice. This is a man who, his personality doesn't have any normal complement of mercy, of liking for other people. He was obsessed with getting Germany a high place in the world. Germany had never had a proper place.
Nazi propaganda was the loudest and most brazen voice in the political crowd. It got much louder when the Nazis gained the support of press magnate Alfred Hugenberg, who owned a vast newspaper and film network. Nazi rallies were already imposing spectacles filled with pageantry and symbolism. Now the Nazis were the first political party to use newspapers and newsreels to spread their message to the entire nation.
They will have massive and very expensive media campaigns, posters, marches, all types of productions. Hitler over Germany, for example. This is one of the first politicians to fly to several cities in one day, Hitler coming out of the skies to be greeted by screaming followers. Somebody yelling, he's coming, almost like he was a messiah.
He was really presented to us as a kindly man who loves children. You could see this in the newsreels quite often. You know, he would always receive flowers from children and embrace them. He loved dogs. He was almost greater than life.
By 1932, Hitler and Goebbels had risen from rejection and obscurity to overseeing a party with 17 million supporters, Germany's largest political force. They had done it largely by whipping up nationalistic pride and fomenting anger towards imagined enemies who were allegedly responsible for Germany's economic and political woes. Their blend of virulent invective, imposing rallies, and intimidation was about to help them gain total control of Germany. Once they had it, their propaganda forces would play a crucial role in building the military machine vital to thrusting Germany into world war. On January 30th, 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg, in an attempt to unify Germany, appointed Adolf Hitler Chancellor. It was an incomplete victory for Hitler because the position did not give him absolute power. He spent his first days as Chancellor scheming to find a way to expand his control. On February 27th, the roar of an inferno broke the quiet of the winter night. The Reichstag was ablaze. Though the cause was not then determined, Nazi propaganda blamed the communists. The next day, Hitler used the fire as the basis for an emergency decree that placed severe restrictions on personal freedoms. More than a decade later, at the Nuremberg trials, the man behind the Reichstag fire was unmasked.
We ascertained that quite generally, Hitler had stated the wish for a large-scale propaganda campaign. Goebbels took on the job of making the necessary proposals, and it was Goebbels who first thought of setting the Reichstag on fire.
Hitler used the Reichstag fire as an excuse to imprison political opponents. He also orchestrated a special vote to increase his powers. Within months of becoming Chancellor, Hitler had started Germany on an inexorable journey towards dictatorship. A critical step came on March 13, 1933, when Goebbels was appointed Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. The little doctor, as he was sometimes referred to, now had absolute control over every aspect of Germany's cultural life. To chronicle his achievements, he kept a secret diary, making thousands of entries. He staffed his ministry with fanatical young Nazis who were willing to do his bidding. Ultimately, he oversaw a propaganda machine that, according to one wartime document, involved more than 400,000 people. One of his first goals was to win the hearts and minds of the millions of Germans who were not National Socialists. The Nazis wanted unswerving unity. To that end, they heavily promoted the idea of a national or people's community where the group comes before the individual.
You had to convince ordinary Germans what were they gaining by placing the community before their own self-interest. And of course there are a number of themes that the Nazis disseminated at that time. The notion of a people's theatre, the notion of a people's car, the Volkswagen. They were promised that if they paid a weekly or a monthly subscription, then eventually they would gain one of these people's cars. These were the type of inducements that the Nazis attempted in order to camouflage what was essentially, of course, subterfuge, because the money that ordinary Germans were paying into these schemes, in fact, was not going towards cars for ordinary Germans. It was essentially going into armaments.
There was, however, one promise that Goebbels did honor, the promise of a radio in every home. The propaganda minister was quick to recognize the power of radio to aid his cause. Less than 2 weeks after he assumed power, he spoke in a secret meeting with the heads of the Reich radio company, where he shared his clandestine plans.
You have in your hands the most modern instrument in existence for influencing the masses. By means of this instrument, you are the creators of public opinion. If you perform this task well, we shall win over the people.
The radio, of course, Goebbels saw as the supreme method, or instrument rather, of propaganda, because this could go into everybody's homes. Now, not everybody could afford deluxe radio sets, so the Nazis produced a set called the People's Receiver, a very cheap radio set that could be bought by even the lowest paid German workers. And in some cases, I mean, subsidies were given even for those, so that the number of radio sets in Germany shot up during the early years of the Nazi regime.
With both radio and most of the leading newspapers firmly in his control, Goebbels had an iron grip on the eyes and ears of the nation. Film was the crown jewel in his propaganda triumvirate and provided him with some of his most impressive and entertaining propaganda. In 1934, a young actress turned director caught Hitler's eye. Impressed by her work, he asked her to document the Nazi Party rally at Nuremberg. Leni Riefenstahl's documentary Triumph of the Will was a cinematic fulfillment of both of Goebbels' key campaigns, Hitler as God and the German people his faithful followers.
It's a brilliant, certainly the cinematography and the use of light, the use of masked men, hundreds of thousands of people who are there to glorify Hitler. I mean, it's tremendously powerful stuff.
Auf der anderen Seite, there was no other filmmaker that he had such a high opinion of. In his own words, there was no other filmmaker who visualized the National Socialistic ideas as brilliantly as she did. There is no higher praise for anyone from a National Socialistic viewpoint. In his eyes, she was the best.
In August 1934, following President Hindenburg's death, Hitler became Führer, or leader, and Chancellor. By that time, Goebbels had refocused the enormous energies of Germany's mass media into one relentless proclamation of the beauty, the power, and the glory of Nazism. But it wasn't enough to simply trust that his campaigns would succeed in their aims. Critical to Goebbels was a means of gauging the response of the German people to his propaganda. For this task, he enlisted the aid of thousands of Nazis who secretly infiltrated the entire nation.
The SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, was the intelligence section of the SS. They were responsible for, well, like a security police, whatever, monitoring what Germans were thinking and saying in public places. And these reports went to the top Nazi leadership, I mean to Himmler obviously as ultimate head of the SD, but also to Goebbels. And of course Goebbels then could see what people, ordinary Germans, were thinking and were saying about the regime, about current affairs.
Both Hitler and Goebbels believed that lying repeatedly was the best way to convince the masses that the lie was in fact the truth. One of Goebbels' biggest lies was the promotion of Hitler as a man of peace. This fabrication clashed with reality as Hitler began to prepare Germany for war. His first step was to strengthen a weak military machine. In the spring of 1935, at great risk of retaliation, Hitler blatantly broke the Versailles Treaty by making military service compulsory. Fearing a public backlash to Hitler's action, Goebbels agonized in his diary.
We must arm and put a good face on the bad situation. Let us, O Lord, survive this summer. Through crises and perils leads the way to our freedom, but it must be traversed bravely.
Of enormous help to Goebbels was an undeniable benefit of Hitler's massive rearmament campaign. Unemployment shrank dramatically while the quality of life for many Germans increased.
I think they were satisfied that my father was working. So things seemed to go better and better every year. I saw more things being bought, the dining room table, so that meant that we were doing better.
Unemployment had been 6 million, now it was down to a few thousand. No one cared that it was done by conscripting all the young people into the army and putting the old people in the armaments industry. People from all over the world, famous people, Lloyd George, Lindbergh from America, came to see and came back with favorable opinions of what Hitler had done.
By 1938, Joseph Goebbels had succeeded almost beyond his own expectations. Despite blatant oppression of the Jews, political opponents and enemies of the state, despite Germany's rapid rearmament, despite the creation of a totalitarian nation, Hitler was winning praise from abroad and from many of his own countrymen. Goebbels' next challenge was to transform Hitler's ruthless military strikes into heroic and honorable acts. The military actions that led to World War II were strongly supported by lies from Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine. Hitler's first aggression beyond Germany's borders was on March 12, 1938, when his troops entered Austria. That same day, German newspapers quoted a fictitious telegram from the Austrian government requesting German troops to prevent chaos. 6 months later, in the days before Germany's occupation of the Sudeten territory in Czechoslovakia, a Reich press chief, Otto Dietrich, claimed that German nationals there were being oppressed. One of his newspaper headlines screamed, "Blood, death and suffering of the Sudeten Germans. And finally, prior to the invasion of Poland, Hitler declared, "I shall give a propagandist cause for starting the war, never mind whether it be plausible or not. The victor shall not be asked later on whether we told the truth or not." Hitler got his propagandist cause by staging a border incident and then fabricating alleged acts of terrorism by Poles against German nationals. On September 1st, 1939, Poland was attacked. World War II had begun. Hitler ordered that his blitzkrieg show no mercy. Tens of thousands of innocent men, women, children, and the elderly were murdered in the onslaught. It was Goebbels' job to show a very different theater of war to the German people. Baptism of Fire, released in 1940, was a documentary that portrayed the destruction of Poland as a glorious and heroic battle. No casualties are shown, only the pristine Luftwaffe delivering its deadly payloads in a graceful ballet. The final scenes of the documentary show the utter decimation of Warsaw, followed by a warning to Great Britain that she may be next. Baptism of Fire typified what would become Goebbels' most important and successful propaganda weapon of war. The Deutsche Wochenschau were weekly newsreels shown in cinemas prior to the main feature. For the most part, they depicted the heroic advances of Germany throughout the war. Other nations, including America and Great Britain, had similar newsreels, but the Wochenschauen were different in several very significant ways.
It was very important from Goebbels' point of view that these should be action newsreels as well. He lambasted any film cameraman that just produced shots of soldiers or sailors at rest or behind the front. He wanted to see his film cameraman right in the front line recording Germany's triumphs, and quite a large percentage of film cameramen were killed during the war in the production of the Wochenschau.
Goebbels would watch them without the soundtrack, without the music, and then he would watch them again, then he would edit the soundtrack, then he'd look at the final product. He knew that these news films impressed Hitler. Goebbels made sure that these were to be treated as almost sacrosanct, almost like being in a church. The doors were shut in the theaters a few minutes before they were shown. You couldn't enter or leave.
As corroborated by Goebbels' secret SD reports, the Wochenschauen were extremely popular among German audiences. Buoyed by these reports, Goebbels took steps to ensure the newsreel's widest possible impact.
Goebbels established a whole mobile cinema service. It was a mobile cinema service that was able to reach the most remote agricultural regions of Germany, and indeed when they began to occupy vast areas of Europe, that was able to reach remote areas throughout Europe as well, occupied Europe.
As German forces rolled almost effortlessly across Europe, Goebbels' work was made easy. It was not difficult to herald Germany as an unstoppable force as nation after nation capitulated.
Germany calling, Germany calling.
At the same time, Goebbels trumpeted Germany's victories and enlisted support for the oppression of Europe's Jews, he waged a third propaganda battle. During a secret conference on October 30th, 1939, Goebbels ordered the construction of clandestine radio stations, specifically designed to broadcast propaganda to the enemy. From December 1939 until the end of the war, Goebbels oversaw 20 such secret stations. Beginning on February 25th, 1940, British listeners could tune in to the new British broadcasting station. The station featured traditional English music and the news of the day. Its programming schedule was listed next to the BBC's in British newspapers. The station's alternative programming and apparently accurate news bulletins began generating an audience, none of whom realized they were listening to broadcasts that originated in a secret radio center in Berlin.
The Germans established a number of radio stations: Radio Caledonia, aimed at the Scots; the Workers' Challenge, aimed at the working classes of Britain; the Christian Peace Movement; and the New British Broadcasting Station, which was a general one. All of these were purporting to be broadcast from within Churchill's Britain and attacking the government in one way or another.
Goebbels' key ally in his secret radio campaign was a British fascist named William Joyce. Joyce, realizing that war between England and Germany was inevitable, came to Germany in 1939 to serve Hitler. In addition to writing many of the scripts broadcast over the secret radio stations, Joyce became an infamous broadcaster dubbed Lord Haw Haw for his supercilious manner.
The British Ministry of Misinformation has been conducting a systematic campaign of frightening British women and girls.
Partly because people were bored and hadn't got anything else to do, the entertainment value. It's the first time in warfare that the Englishman, it said, could listen to treason being spoken in his own front room, coming from the beloved wireless set, as it was known. And I think that for most people, it was Joyce that sort of conjured up Nazi Germany, probably even more than Hitler, Goering and Goebbels, because he was speaking in English.
Diary entry, January 5th, 1940. Our English language broadcasts are stirring things up in London. Our speaker has the nickname Lord Haw Haw over there. Everyone is talking about him, and that is important for us. We could not ask for anything better.
After less than 2 years of waging war, Adolf Hitler was well in his way to defeating Europe. All the while, Goebbels was waging his own secret war, a battle to poison the hearts and souls of Europe against the Jews. Based on transparent lies and a combination of ideological and psychological propaganda, Goebbels' war would lead to the brutal murder of millions.
Nationalfinanzjudentum in und außerhalb Europas gelingen sollte, die Völker noch einmal in einen Weltkrieg zu stürzen, dann wird das Ergebnis nicht der Sieg des Judentums sein, sondern die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa.
Adolf Hitler's plan to exterminate Europe's Jews began with the murder of innocent German citizens. On October 1st, 1939, 1 month after Germany attacked Poland, Hitler authorized an order to eliminate German citizens with incurable diseases or deformities. Estimates are that under this euthanasia program, close to 100,000 men, women, and children were lethally injected, gassed, or shot. As rumors began to swirl, a few protests were made. An insidious propaganda response quickly followed.
The film I Accuse was a very well-made film. Shows a woman who's stricken with something that appears to be like muscular dystrophy or some terrible disease, and she says, "I'm not afraid of death, just of dying," and she wants others to help her, but it's against the law. And the whole purpose of the film is to show you that if you've heard something about people being killed, it's a lie. In other words, the film itself was based on a lie, but it wanted to get people to think about euthanasia in a nice way.
Secret SD reports indicated a generally positive response to the film. However, some Catholic clergy sought to prevent people from seeing it. One SD survey stated, "There are reports that Catholic priests have used house visits to try to stop individual members of the population from going to see the film." Ultimately, to avoid losing broad support for the war, Hitler officially ended his euthanasia program in August 1941. Unofficially, the campaign continued. Regardless, 18 million people saw I Accuse. This commercial success of a propaganda film that claimed to be solving a social problem paved the way for Hitler's final solution. By 1938, with absolutely no opposition, the Nazis had succeeded in stripping Jews of all civil, legal, and human rights. In November of that year, Goebbels helped orchestrate the infamous Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. Thousands of Jewish shops were vandalized, dozens of Jews murdered, and tens of thousands thrown into concentration camps.
I remember because I was working in a house down below. On the street was a beauty parlor where I worked, and down in the cellar was a wine cellar, and that was a Hungarian Jews. And the mist that one, everything was done at night in Kristallnacht. But that one they missed it because he doesn't know really if he was Jewish or not, but later on they find out, and the SS came in with a little axe, and cut off all the wine bottles and the big barrel was wine, and let the wine run on the ground. Also there was at least 1 or 2 feet high the wine in the wine cellar.
I remember seeing people with the Jewish star in the streetcar, and then you didn't see them anymore.
By the beginning of 1940, hundreds of thousands of European Jews were deported to and imprisoned in concentration camps in the East. That same year, several films were released to justify these actions and to convince the German people that a Jewish problem existed and needed to be dealt with. The most successful of them was a film called Jud-Sus.
Aber nicht sein Herzog.
Ich werde sehen.
Jud-Sus tells the story of a conniving, lustful, violent Jew who threatens to destroy all that is good and pure in an 18th century German town.
Die geheimen Orders, die wir bei ihm gefunden haben.
In the end, the city is saved, the main character hanged, and all Jews forever banned.
Und mein Sohn, lass mir mein Leben! Ich will leben! Das Leben will ich!
The SD reports, the Gestapo reports, and some of the other reports that were percolating back to the propaganda ministry tended to be, on the whole, very, very positive. This is something that German people could identify with. They were entertained, but also the political message was being fed into the people at that time. So Goebbels himself, in his diaries, claims that this was a truly sort of wonderful success.
It is on record that after viewing the film in Vienna, a group of Hitler Youth boys set upon an elderly Jew and kicked him to death.
Far more blatant was The Eternal Jew. Also released in 1940, it was personally commissioned by Goebbels, who remained heavily involved throughout its production.
Richard Wagner hat einmal gesagt, der Jude ist der plastische Dämon des Verfalls der Menschheit. Und diese Bilder bestätigen die Richtigkeit seines Ausspruchs.
The film, presented as a documentary, portrays the Jews as nomads, spreading plague in an effort to destroy other races. The analogy made between Jews and rats blatantly infers that Jews are vermin, not human, and must be exterminated.
Sie sind hinterlistig, feige und grausam und treten meist in großen Scharen auf. Sie stellen unter den Tieren das Element der heimtückischen unterirdischen Zerstörung dar. Nicht anders als die Juden unter den Menschen.
The Eternal Jew inflamed existing German anti-Semitism, and for millions of others encouraged apathy toward the Jews' plight. It served the same purposes when shown in occupied nations. Finally, along with Jud-Sus, it was mandatory viewing for concentration camp guards.
Internal memoranda within Himmler's SS empire, there are directives from Himmler ordering that this film and The Eternal Jew, the documentary, should be shown to concentration camp staff about to implement the final solution, as well as the populations of the eastern occupied territories, in the sense of making them sort of passive spectators to what was going to go on.
Even as Hitler was winning his war against the Jews, his military machine was facing its first serious challenge. After being turned back by the RAF in the Battle of Britain, Hitler prepared to attack the Soviet Union in the spring of 1941. As absolute secrecy was vital, Goebbels and Hitler devised a plan. On June 12th, Goebbels published an article inferring that an attack on England was imminent. The foreign press bought the story, concluding that Germany's massive troop buildup on its eastern border was part of the ruse. On June 22, 1941, 153 German divisions attacked the Soviet Union. In less than a month, they were two-thirds of the way to Moscow. As with earlier Nazi conquests, Goebbels' job was easy. But just a few months later, in October, Goebbels suffered a major blow.
Otto Dietrich, who was in Hitler's headquarters and was in charge of the press, dealing with the press all over the world, came from the headquarters and he made the announcement that the war in Russia was almost over. The last offensive was now beginning and Moscow would be taken. Well, I was stunned.
Goebbels was also stunned, but for a very different reason.
Goebbels knew instinctively this might be a fairly long war. Yes, the Red Army was losing. Yes, it was retreating, but it wasn't behaving like the French army or the Danish army or the Belgian army. It was fighting on in vast Russia.
The coming months bore this out, and Germany's ill-supplied troops hunkered down for a long, brutal Russian winter. Goebbels dealt with this huge setback by ordering the press to completely avoid the subject. Whereas he'd used lies in the past, now he simply didn't tell the truth. His strategy worked in keeping most Germans in the dark, but it backfired in that, despite dire consequences, many people looked elsewhere for news.
It became a punishable offence to listen to foreign broadcasts, and if you did listen to them, and you were caught spreading what Radio Paris or the BBC or whatever, and later Moscow and the American stations were saying, then you were liable to be beheaded, the capital punishment in Germany, and that did happen to a number of what were called radio traitors.
I woke up in the middle of the night and saw light in the kitchen, and entered the kitchen real quiet-like, and there were my parents sitting at the kitchen table facing each other with a blanket over their head and listening to the radio. And my folks being just so overwhelmed that I walked in on them, that my mother took me by the side and she made me promise never to discuss this with anybody because they were listening to the BBC.
Goebbels' intricate web of lies and deceit was slowly being torn apart. More and more Germans refused to believe what they were told. Faced with eroding trust and support, Goebbels would resort to further deceit and ultimately desperation in a final attempt to stave off the inevitable. The winter of 1942 brought with it millions of German casualties on the Eastern Front. No longer able to ignore the situation, Goebbels began a campaign to praise the heroic struggles of the troops and called on all Germans to make sacrifices for the war effort. Given that many Germans were dealing with Allied air attacks, shortages of basic commodities, and the loss of loved ones, Goebbels' task of keeping up morale was a monumental one.
Dr. Goebbels überzeugt sich selbst von der planmäßigen Durchführung der angeordneten Maßnahmen.
German losses in Russia combined with setbacks on the Western and African fronts to paint an undeniably bleak picture. Goebbels needed a miracle to rally German morale from its all-time low. He got one in January 1943.
These great war leaders, Roosevelt and Churchill, decide the terms for the Axis powers. Unconditional surrender.
Unconditional surrender, what does it mean? It means the women will be raped by these subhuman Russians in the Red Army, the children will be deported to slave labor, and the men will be killed.
Diary entry, January 1943. By the demand for unconditional surrender, Churchill and Roosevelt have succeeded in achieving what my propaganda alone could have done only with the greatest difficulty. To weld the German people together in a solid block, which will be victorious or go down to destruction. He who today might still think of opposition against us or peace with the enemy is a hopeless fool and should have his head chopped off for his stupidity.
Just weeks after the Nazis finally acknowledged their defeat at Stalingrad, Goebbels had succeeded in reviving Germany's fighting spirit. With Hitler occupied by military matters, Goebbels had emerged as the Nazis' predominant spokesman. Convinced that success could only come with a complete mobilization of the home front, Goebbels initiated his rally for what he called total war. But Hitler resisted his propaganda minister's request to conscript women and to stop all commercial production. All Goebbels could do was continue to pressure Hitler to acquiesce and continue to harp on his anti-Bolshevik campaign.
We heard many horror stories on the radio, how very brutal the combat is on the Eastern Front. That not only soldiers but civilians as well would lose their life. And they would talk about the Russian hordes. I think that many Germans tried to fight that off, the fear of what's coming from the east.
Gruben von 16 mal 20 Metern wurden die Leichen in 12
Goebbels turned fear of Russia into hysteria when in April a mass grave filled with thousands of murdered Polish officers was discovered in Russia's Kachin forest. The little doctor wasted no time in presenting lurid accounts of what he called the latest atrocity of Jewish officers of the Red Army. The gruesome event raised morale and strengthened German resolve to resist the Russians. Less than a month later, Kachin was forgotten as Allied forces stepped up their campaign in relentless day and night bombing raids throughout Germany. Goebbels did not need his secret police reports to ascertain that German spirit was close to collapsing. What Germans wanted was an end to the bombing, and that required military force. Goebbels gave it to them. He announced the development of secret weapons that, when unleashed, would avenge all German suffering. The mystery weapons were called Vergeltung, meaning revenge or retaliation.
As regards the question of Vergeltung, discussed by the entire German people with such heated passion, I can only say that the English commit an exceedingly fatal error if they believe that this is a mere rhetorical or propagandist slogan with no reality behind it. England will one day make acquaintance with this reality.
As the autumn of 1943 turned into the winter of 1944 and the revenge weapons did not materialize, Goebbels was for the first time in his career at a loss. Things got even worse when the first of the vengeance weapons, the V-1 rockets, were finally deployed in June and failed to deliver anything close to a miracle. While the V-1 and V-2 rockets did considerable damage to England, it quickly became clear that they were not going to alter the course of the war. What did alter the course of Goebbels' propaganda war was an assassination attempt on Hitler in July. A few days later, Hitler granted Goebbels the title of Reich Trustee of Total War.
And on the way back to Berlin that night in the train, Goebbels says to his staff officers, if I'd have been given these powers when I wanted them 18 months ago, victory would probably be ours by now, or it's at least in sight. But it takes a bomb under his arse for Hitler to see reason.
Goebbels directed the formation of the Volkssturm, the People's Army. Every man between the ages of 16 and 60, and many women as well, were ordered to join the Volkssturm and defend Germany.
I was drafted. And we was all, I think 50 British altogether, and close to the former Polish border, and we have to dig the trenches for the soldiers. And that was September until end of January, for 5 months in the winter time. And you know, and from that time then, in January, I have to get out because I couldn't go back to my old hometown anymore. It was already surrounded from the Russian soldier, yeah, from the Russian front. And then I was lost.
As the nation collapsed around him, Goebbels secretly searched for a miracle. He looked back into the past, desperate for an example of German courage in the face of overwhelming odds. He found it in the Prussian city of Kolberg's fierce resistance to Napoleon. Goebbels ordered that a film be made based on the story of Kolberg. He insisted that no expense be spared. This film would be his legacy to the Third Reich.
In the making of the film, and this is on the orders of a man, mind you, who had proclaimed total war, 187,000 soldiers were used as extras. He ordered up 12,000 German sailors to appear in the film. Admiral Dönitz, the Commander-in-Chief of the Navy, put his foot down and said, "No, I need these men." Goebbels went over his head to Hitler, and he got those 12,000 sailors to act as extras. Salt was used as snow for the battle scenes. It was absolutely lavish colour production.
Goebbels ended the film with a miraculous victory, despite the fact that historically the French eventually overwhelmed Kolberg. But Goebbels' retelling of history couldn't save the Third Reich. As he was forced to accept defeat, Goebbels implemented his last propaganda campaign, one based on desperation, terror, and reprisal. He enlisted the support of fanatical Hitler youth, whipping them up into marauding bands called werewolves.
At the Nuremberg trials, I think it's Reich who says, well, the werewolf was something which was very much the creation of Goebbels. And the werewolf organizations were attempting to maintain morale essentially by means of fear and coercion. And they were threatening people that if they gave up, you know, if they were, for example, in the People's Army, the Landsturm or the Volkssturm, that if they gave up their weapons and deserted, then these werewolf organizations would find them and they would, in many cases, they would kill them.
But the werewolves were a feckless last gasp. On May 1st, 1945, with Hitler having committed suicide and the Russians entering Berlin, Goebbels and his wife poisoned their 6 children. They then had themselves shot by an SS orderly. In the ensuing decades, Germany and the rest of the world gradually came to learn the truth about the lies Goebbels and Hitler had propagated. Most have reacted in shame, horror, and with a determination to never allow this history to repeat itself. But as a new century begins, Goebbels' influence continues to be felt in isolated acts of violence and in more pervasive expressions of manipulation and intolerance. This is his legacy, the force of hate which Goebbels so successfully marshaled, the apathy he so successfully engendered, and the tragic, unspeakable consequences of the two combined. It is a legacy we must never forget.
I think Goebbels' skill was that he recognized that propaganda could reinforce prejudices. And I think that's the lesson that I take from propaganda.
I think Nazi propaganda at any time is terrible and horrible. But I'm not surprised that there are some people who like that. We had them before the war. I think we have to watch our step in America and really enforce the Constitution, because I think the potential for such people still exists.
This is such a long trip into the past, over 50 years, and looking over my shoulder, it's like a different life. And knowing what I know now, it is almost unbelievable that we believed what we heard and that we believed what we were told. Because the suffering that was going on at that time, everybody suffered.